Hi everyone. Today is Thursday, February 24th, 2022. I'm Crystal Dawn Hill, and I'm here to do the in-depth part or part 2 of my spiritual journey. I'm going to go in depth about parts of my journey that I discussed previously in either the overview of this part or in part 1. And I'm going to go in depth of some parts that are the most impactful to my individual journey. In the 7 years of my journey that I'm going to cover in this part of the series, there's so much. It's like so much compacted into these 7 years, and they span over the ages of about 34 to 42 and the years 2002 to 2010. So as I said in the overview of this part, my voice is a little shaky. I was actually going to upload the overview and then record this part, but I decided while it's all fresh in my mind, I might as well go ahead and record this part and then upload them one right after the other. So while it's all in my mind, fresh, I might as well just dive right in. So I'm going to start by when I moved in, and the one friend that I mentioned who's been there for me even after we both bought our own homes. One of my first awarenesses of my gifts was she was working in her flower bed, and I saw a light around her. And it was a very angelic light, and I knew she was special. And she was very quiet and reserved, and she kept to herself, and very private person. And I always respected that. But over the years, I did get to know her quite well, and she's a very, very beautiful soul. So that was the first awareness that I had of my ability to see, or my clairvoyant ability. Then I met an elderly neighbor, and she was very sweet as well. And we did have a few neighbors that were quite challenging to live near, but I won't go into that. It was a nice balance, I'll just say that. So I moved there in 2002, and as I said, I was already familiar with the maintenance person, and I had sort of a heart connection with him, and felt like I needed to get to know him for some reason. I felt a youthful exuberance around him, and I could sense that he felt the same, and I wouldn't find out what that was all about until many years later. And when I discovered what it was, it just blew my mind. So I will go into that in this part, just not right now. So I'm going to try to unpack this whole 7 years sort of in chronological order, as best I can recall. So then I met the gentleman who lived over me, and he was the gentleman I mentioned in the overview that was sort of a guide, and made a strong impact, and he was a mirror for me to reflect to me abilities that I had. And one of those things, one of the most poignant moments of our camaraderie, so to speak, was he didn't believe in, or at least he said he didn't believe in spiritual abilities and gifts and all that. Pardon me. And we were sitting outside one day, and I said, "Watch this." And I was just kind of joking. I didn't really mean it, but I was like, I'll watch the wind blow. I'll make the wind blow. And I was guided to say it, but I was like, in my mind, I was going, really? Am I really saying this to him? Well, the wind did pick up right after that. And I was just amazed by it as he was. And I looked over at him and he had tears streaming down his face. And he never was the same with me since. He always seemed to have a reverence for me and a higher respect for me. And I would always, whenever we would talk about, because when he would introduce me to someone, he would tell them about that. And I would just laugh and I would say, I didn't really do that. I just felt guided to say it. I said it was really God doing it. So it was the first opportunity for me to see the gift that God had bestowed upon me, but also a wonderful opportunity for me to give glory to God that I had never really recognized before. So that was really beautiful. So I moved there in um, 2002, and then in 2003 is when some medical um, tumultuous times struck our family. My the elder of my two older brothers, he was diagnosed, excuse me, he had a very severe stroke and was hospitalized for several months. And during that time, our dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So this is when the clergy member that I had mentioned in my overview, this is when he stepped in, because I was the one that was trying to be there for everybody and work a 40-hour job and transport my mom back and forth to the hospital where my brother was, and transport myself even further away from home to the city where my dad was hospitalized. And all of that back and forth and trying to hold down my job and trying to take care of myself, it was quite a challenge for me. And I don't know if I was really having a breakdown or if I was just emotionally and mentally exhausted. And so that's when my pastor really taught me to just give it all to God and to not carry so much of the burden on my own. So I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to him for helping me to understand that. And it did help. It did help. In a way, it helped me to relieve myself of some of the burden, but at the same time, um, it set me on a path of self-realization. And that's when I began to detach from my family and all of the unhealthy and dysfunctional patterns that were very rigidly intact in my family. And so overall, of course, that was a wonderful thing, and that is what facilitated a lot of my spiritual growth. So I spent a lot of time in my spare time out in the yard writing in my journal, just as I had said before. And I also, was getting to know the maintenance person and getting acquainted with him. And of course, I was the one sharing most of what I was experiencing and shooting the breeze with him. And, sometimes it was a lighthearted and simple and fun. And other times it was quite deep, but it was not romantic. It was just a friendship. And I could sense that. And I totally respected that. And I, of course, knew that my path was much greater than what his life would ever have encompassed. And, or I shouldn't say greater, I should say deeper and more expansive on a spiritual level. Whereas, he was living a very 3D life. And I could recognize that and understood that we weren't, anything romantic. So that is what consumed, other than my 40-hour job, that is what consumed most of my days, was writing in the journal, meditating, listening to music, taking care of regular everyday things. We didn't have a laundry area where I lived, so I had to go to the laundromat and, you know, do all of that. So, and I lived I worked about 30 minutes from home. So that was how I spent most of my time. And then in 2007, in the fall, I started having some symptoms of nausea and stuff like that. And I had consulted a friend of mine who had been in the medical field, and she said it sounded like gallbladder issues. So I got, I saw a physician, and they did an ultrasound, and I had an extremely large gallstone. And so I had to have surgery. And then, again, this was 2007. I had to have surgery, and I was on short-term leave for about 10 days. And during that time, I spent a lot of time online. And at the time, of course, as some of you may remember, MySpace was the big social media back then. And I met someone on MySpace, and when I saw his profile picture, I was like, I need to meet him. And just, there was this twinkle in his eye and a gentleness in his soul. And I knew that I needed to meet him. And he was local. And I found out where he worked, and I actually knew a couple people who were acquainted with him. So I asked their opinion of his character, and they spoke of him very favorably. So I reached out, and we talked for a while, and then he was going on a short trip out of state to visit family. And when he came back, we had our first date in November. And he was my karmic partner. And I could sense in the beginning that we weren't meant to be together. I could sense that we were meant to be friends or acquaintances, but he wanted it to be romantic right away, and I felt hard for him. I felt, I can't say I was in love with him the way like in a spiritual sense, the way I'm in love with my divine masculine, but I did feel a very warm heart connection with him, and loved him very much as a person, and still do care for him a great deal. And so we were back and forth with that relationship. And at the end of my time at my apartment, we were in a breakup, and that was halfway through our 7-year relationship. And then after I bought my home, and we got back together for another 3 years, and then ended the relationship for good. And I'll go all into that during my part 3 when I talk about the period of time that I owned my own home. But for today, I'm going to stick with everything that happened when I lived at the apartment, and that was just part of that. So I want to back up to before my dad was diagnosed with cancer. That was in 2003, and he had just moved to our area within the past couple years before his diagnosis, and we were getting very close, and getting to know him and finding out things about his interests and his perception of life and his past experiences and everything really gave me a deep, deep sense of myself, and helped restore my sense of personal identity, which I had lost in my marriage, because I completely lost myself to him and had taken on his identity completely and just completely lost myself. So my dad helped restore that. It was a beautiful time for me. I had always felt a bond with him, even during the years that we didn't stay in contact very much. We always had that bond, and it was just really beautiful. And I didn't have that with my mom. So the bond with my dad was even more special. because it was like he played the emotional role of both mom and dad for me, that my mom was not able um, to provide for me based on her own journey, her own life. So, um, so one time when my dad was visiting, we went to the park, and I often went to the park and swung on the swings because it gave me a sense of freedom. And this particular day, I was feeling a lot of emotion because of everything that was going on and that had gone on with me. And it was like, I was a kid again, and he was pushing me, and it was pushing me like I had a lot of momentum and I was swinging really high. And, and all of a sudden, I could feel my soul wanting to leave my body. And it was an exhilarating feeling, but it was also very scary. And it was like that feeling of just losing myself. And I jumped out of the swing and landed on the ground and just fell to the ground and just wept like a baby. And I don't know if you can see from where I am from the camera, but I'm getting teary-eyed just thinking about it and talking about it. And as I said in my overview of this part, my voice was a little shaky thinking about sharing all this. And it's times like these that, make me a little apprehensive because I've never shared my story out in the open. And there's certain intimate parts like this that I've only shared with a very few people. So this is a whole new level of vulnerability and openness for me. But I know that I've been needing to do this for a really long time. And what I've really wanted to do for many years is write a book. But I kept trying to write a book and it just kept hitting dead ends, and I just didn't feel like it was the time. And if I ever were to write an autobiography, it would be details of my personal life as well as my spiritual journey. It would all be blended in together. So I don't know if that will ever happen, but I did feel like it was very important to get my spiritual journey out there for the benefit of others, and that's why I'm doing this. And so my dad fell to the ground with me. He knelt down and he's like, "Honey, what's wrong? What's wrong?" And I'm like, "I don't know." And I really did know, but I didn't want to tell him because I'd never heard anyone talking about this, and I didn't want him to be concerned. And frankly, I was afraid of him understanding and telling me what it was, and maybe I wasn't ready for that. But it was a very, very strange moment for me. And I knew what it was. I understood it. I knew I just wanted to be with my beloved that I could always feel. And I didn't know who it was at the time. I thought I did. But that was the other near twin, not the maintenance person, but the other near twin that I had met, and that I had become aware of in my 20s. And I hadn't yet met him. I did meet him on the phone later. But I just knew that I needed to be home. And I actually found out just in the, that's just my other phone ringing. It's just a telemarketer, and I'm just going to disregard it. Anyway, I would find out many years later why that happened that day. And I'll share that at the probably in the last couple of parts of this series of my journey. So later in 2003, my dad did pass away, and that was a very sad time for me. And my brother was still in the hospital recovering from his stroke, and he did come out of the hospital, and he didn't recover fully, but he did recover his mobility, and his cognizance, and we were all very grateful for that. And he survived for several years after his stroke, so we were grateful for that. I think that's about all I wanted to talk about as far as my family medical issues that had happened. I was still struggling with my finances and with kind of getting myself together on an emotional level. And during that time, that's when all the mystical stuff really, really started taking place for real, like big time. One of the things that happened to me when I lived there, and I had mentioned in part one that we had a courtyard, and I spent a lot of time out in the courtyard and just walking and sitting and writing in my journal and meditating and just going within. And excuse me, I'm going to get a tissue. I'm on the floor so that you have somewhat of a nice background. One of the things that happened to me that I found really interesting was one day I was walking around and I looked down and I noticed a crack in the sidewalk, and it was shaped like the letter Y. And I just heard yes. And I felt like that was a higher being guiding me and encouraging me to say yes to whatever it was that was calling me. And I started to see the letter Y everywhere in the branches of trees, in sidewalks, in trinkets, in, just everywhere. Even the word yes, I would see sometimes. And it really got my attention. And another thing that really got my attention was the 11. And as we all know, when we start on the spiritual journey, we see a lot of numbers that really get our attention, and 1111 is the most prominent of those numbers. But I intuitively knew what the 11 was for me in my personal journey. I hadn't heard about it. I hadn't read about it other than maybe seeing it on a clock, online or something like that. But I had never read about it or understood what it meant. But for me, it represented the pillars of the gates of heaven. And I knew that that's what was calling me. I knew that's what my whole journey was about. That was my ultimate goal, was to get to heaven. And when I started seeing the 11 and the 1111 everywhere, I knew that that's what that meant for me. And when I started seeing it online and reading about it in the Twin Flame community, I was sometimes taken aback by the way people were explaining it and what they thought it represented for them. Just for me, it was very different. I had never heard that explanation about it anywhere. And so that was another prominent thing. And then synchronicities between me and other people. Like I'd be thinking about something and someone would say it, and the maintenance guy would be wearing a certain color, and I would have already put that color on that day. And it was just all this different stuff. I knew his real name. Like he went by his first name at work, and I wanted to know his middle name, and I think he told me the first letter, and in my mind, my first guess was my brother's name, but something told me no, and so I guessed something else, and it wasn't a very common name, and that really blew my mind too. I was like, how did I know that? So it's like all these people around me were mirroring back to me my gifts and abilities that I was starting to discover. And the gentleman that lived above me, that um, he thought that I made the wind blow. He was also one of those people that mirrored a lot about my abilities back to me, and just my general, nature and state of being. And oh, yes, how could I forget this? Another very special friend that I met when I lived there was my cat, Solomon. Um, some gentlemen that were working for my landlord were temporarily living in one of the apartments. And one day I was outside, and one of the guys had this itty bitty little baby kitten. He didn't even look like he was old enough to be away from his mother. And I was petting the little kitten and holding it and everything, and then I gave it back. And I never knew what happened to the guys or the cats after that. And oh yes, I guess they had moved out, but they were still working for my landlord. So one day, I happened to look out on my back banister, and there were these two kittens on my banister, and I didn't recognize them as as the kitten that I had met from the neighbor. Um, but I wanted to lure them inside. I wanted one of them. I knew I couldn't keep both of them, but I wanted one of them. And so I lured them inside with the only thing I had on hand that day was hot dogs. And so I just cut up the hot dog and lured them in with that. And then as soon as I trapped them and got them safe and everything, I ran to the store and got some food and everything. So um, anyway, not to go into minute detail about the cats because that would be boring, but the one that I kept was the boy, and he was the more rambunctious of the two. I knew I wanted one with personality. And so I took the male, and we just immediately had a very deep soul bond. And he taught me a lot on my journey as well. And unfortunately, later down the road, I had since adopted another cat as well, and had to surrender both of them to the Humane Society, and I was so desperately sad about that. But it all turned out for the best because I wouldn't have been able to care for them when I went through my blindness and everything. And I'll probably go into a little bit more detail about that later down the line. But he was a very special part of my journey too. And I got him, I took him in from outdoors when I was there. So I couldn't have left out that part of having him in my life, because I called him my um, space kitty, because I felt like he really was like the cat from outer space. It was like that. It was almost like he talked to me, he communicated with me, and he understood me, and it was just beautiful. I loved him very much. Um, so I think I've shared all of the odds and ends details about the different people and circumstances and everything that I went through. Now I want to get to the parts and the people that have more significance in my soul journey. And of course, in 2007, I met my karmic, and that was a whole nother story in itself that I'm not going to elaborate on, because that's more my personal journey than it was my spiritual journey. But there were components of our relationship that kind of prepared me and opened me up for my twin journey, and so I'm very grateful for that. Um, But the friend that I mentioned in the overview, that we had a lot of synchronicities and quirks and things in common, um, there was something that I experienced with her that also correlated with what I talked about seeing all of these Y's, the letter Y everywhere. And this part of the story is going to be a little extensive, but I want to share it in detail here as part of this, because if I don't, then it might not fit anywhere else in my story. So I want to make sure I share it because it's really cool. So where I worked was in a retail store, and I worked in the office, and the manager that I had at the time was wonderful. And um, I don't know if he had asked me to clean out the lost and found, or if I was just bored and took it upon myself. But in the lost and found, I found this pendant, and it was a heart shaped. It was pewter in color, and I guess the material might have been pewter as well, but it was metal, and that was the color it was. And I should get it and show it to you. I think I'll just share a picture later, but it had the letter Y on it, like a curly with a curly tail, like a U shape at the top, and then a curly tail instead of the normal two lines shaped, into a Y. And I showed this to him and said, after 30 days, which was our policy, would it be all right if I have it? And he said, it's been in there a long time already. You're welcome to take it now. And I was so excited because it was going to be like the piece of jewelry that I wore all the time. I went out and bought a chain for it. At the time, it was in fashion to have those little beads on your chain, and I got some of those so that it wasn't just hanging there by itself. And I was just so happy to don that necklace every day. And because my friend, my neighbor, already knew the part about my story about seeing all the letter Y everywhere, I wanted to tell her about this. Now, I had never seen a pendant that looked like this anywhere in my life, anywhere even similar. And I took it over and knocked on her door, and I don't remember if she was able to talk with me then, or if she asked me to come back or whatever. But anyway, when I showed her the pendant, she said, hold on just a minute. And I didn't know what she was doing, but I waited at her door for a few minutes, and she came back and she had the exact same pendant. My mind was absolutely blown away. And we'd already been laughing and been amazed by all the synchronicities that we had. And incidentally, our names started with the same letter too. So that was even another synchronicity. So I'm like, there's something really bigger than myself going on here. And I had no idea what it was. I had no idea where it was leading me. I just knew that I needed to just follow it to a T and just do everything. And I would start doing like things that were out of character for me. Like I would say things to people that I never would have had the courage to say before. I was doing little quirky things in my house on my own, like making recordings of my self-talking like I'm doing here. Maybe I had the intention of sharing that with someone someday, and I still have it. Maybe I'll dig it out and play it and record myself playing it so that I can share that as well. It's funny because I remember something I said on one of them about finding out who I truly am. I've heard my divine masculine say that so many times. So when I heard him, I thought that was really cool. So that pendant is really one of the most significant things about the whole time that I lived there. When my friend and I both had the same pendant, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. The only difference is hers looked a little newer, like mine looked a little dark, like it needed to be cleaned. And hers was shinier, but other than that, they were just identical. It was just incredible. So I'm looking down at my notes, but they're not close enough to me for me to be able to see them. So I'm just going to pull my notebook a little closer. And I did say earlier on that my videos aren't scripted, and typically they're not. But doing these journey videos, I did want a bullet point thing so that I wouldn't leave anything out and have to go back and retrack, or, you know, make the video over or do something, you know, in hindsight. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep everything concise and in the video that it's supposed to be in. So okay, there is one thing at the bottom of my list that I haven't mentioned, and that was kind of ties in with where I left off just now, which is a lot of peculiar things going on with me when I was by myself. So one thing that I noticed is I was feeling spiritual presences a lot more frequently than I ever had before. And when I was little, I would feel them, but I didn't understand it or think it was real. And this time, I could tell that it was more real. Oh, and one other thing that doesn't hold a lot of significance is when I had my awakening and when I had started having all these experiences, I started being a magnet for a lot of different members of the divine masculine. People that I already had been acquainted with earlier in my life were feeling drawn to me, and they were all on their own journey, and I didn't get involved with any of them except one schoolmate that I did see for a couple times, and I talked about him briefly before, and I'm not going to go into that with him about him, but I was noticing that a lot. And there were two incidents that I experienced at nighttime, at bedtime, or just before bedtime. One was very bright and positive, and the other one was very dark and low energy. The bright positive one was that one night I was lying in bed just meditating, and my whole room was filled with blue light. And I knew that I was being visited by something higher. I felt like it was extraterrestrial in nature. I never saw any light beings or shapes that looked like an actual being. I just felt the light and felt a lot of love and warmth and acceptance from that light. And then the other time was one night I was getting ready for bed, and I went in my bedroom, and I didn't see this with my visual eyes, but I could see it with my inner vision, that there was this being seated on the side of my bed looking out the window, and he was very low energy. He was deformed physically. He was very, I'm not going to say heavy, but his body was just built very round, like his shoulders were very round, his back was curved, and his head was very large and very round. And he had long, stringy black hair, sort of like in a bowl-shaped cut, and his face was very enlarged and protrusive, and was his complexion was very blemished, and you know, like the surface of it was indented. And I didn't hear his voice. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. I was very tripped out by it, but at the same time I felt a lot of deep compassion and sorrow for him because he felt so sad. And I knew that it was just an aspect of myself that I needed to integrate. And I think I left the room for a moment, and I think my guide kind of comforted me and said, it's okay. He's not going to harm you. He's not there to scare you or intimidate you. And I just gently said, I love you. You're okay. You can go to the light and be in peace. And that was the last encounter I ever had with him. But I never forgot about him because he was such a sad creature and lost. And I just wish that there had been more that I could do for him. And that's the last thing I think that I felt like I wanted to mention. Just that was the kind of polarity. There is one more thing. It just occurred to me. But there was a lot of polarity in all of my experiences and, everything in between, the darkness and the light. And that was the most prominent time of my individual journey. And then, of course, the transitional time that I had mentioned in the overview was when I moved to the house, and then I started to transition into more of the twin flame essence rather than living my individual essence. There were times that I even wondered that if I was actually a walk-in that somehow maybe took place the day that I had that experience with my dad on the swing. And I think in a way it was a walk-in experience, but not where my soul stepped out and another soul stepped in, but rather just a higher aspect of myself stepped in to guide me and assist me. Because my demeanor changed, my personality changed a little bit. My belief system was blown wide open, and everybody around me was noticing a significant difference. And so I'll probably share more about that sometime, laced in between other stories. But that's about all I wanted to say about it now. But the one other thing that I must share, and when I was a guest on Soul Speaks 5D, I did share this in the interview. So this isn't the first time me sharing this. I remember, I don't know if I was dreaming or if it was during a waking meditation that I had this experience, but I was visited by a being, an old man, with the proverbial white robe and long beard. And he guided me to, let's see, that was two different dreams. He guided me to this room that I was told was called the White Room. And in that white room was me and my divine masculine's essence. I couldn't see him physically. I could only feel his presence with me. And we signed a contract. And I also had another experience in which I signed a contract with my divine masculine, and that was a dream that I had had a while after that, I believe. But when I had that dream, when I had that visitation, it may have been a dream, I can't recall now, but either way, I believed the presence was the maintenance person, but it didn't resonate, and it wasn't in alignment because there were things about his energy that didn't match the energy that I could sense during that vision, during that experience. So I wouldn't find out who that was until years later. It could have been an aspect of the maintenance person's energy, just to give me a form of reference because I hadn't yet met my divine masculine. But that dream was, or that vision, or that experience was extremely profound. And when I came out of that and came back into my body, I was transformed in a very significant way. And it was probably the first dream that I had ever had that I can recall where I could feel myself in that space, not just in my mind, but I could feel my physical body in that space. So I knew that I had astral traveled. And if I remember correctly, I had set intentions to want to astral travel, but didn't really know how to go about doing it. I had had an spontaneous astral projection when I was still married. I had dozed off on the couch listening to a Sylvia Brown meditation, and I had a spontaneous astral projection, and I found myself. You, the camera isn't pointing high enough to show above my window, but it was like right up above the window in the ceiling. I found myself and had to get back into my body before I could get completely awake. That really was an awakening experience in and of itself. So I think that's everything I want to share today about my 7 years at the apartment. I guess what I will share in closing is how I came to have my house. So I worked in a DIY store, and one of my regular customers was a real estate agent. And she started encouraging me to look into buying a house. And I was like, I'm not in a financial situation. I can't do it. I don't have the wherewithal to run my own household and everything. And she really kept encouraging me. And so finally in 2010, I bought my house. So when I start part three, if I think of anything else that I left out today, I may do a recap before I actually start sharing the story of when I bought my house. But I think because I was a little bit more on top of things and made my list and made sure I covered everything on the list, I do believe that I shared pretty much everything that I feel is significant on my spiritual journey. So the one thing I did leave out was the interim period between the two times I was with my karmic, but I'm not going to share much about him anyway. So that was a pretty sad time for me because I really loved and wanted to be back with him. But all of my karmic healing really took place in the second part of our relationship. So I'm very grateful for that. So that's all I want to share today. Thank you all very much for listening and being interested in my journey. I wish you all the very best along your journey as well, and have a wonderful day.